What up, HSM? It's your boy Dave coming at you live via the internets. I hope you had a good day. I hope you had a chance to read Mark 14. I hope you have your Bibles open because we are just going to jump on in. If you got a chance to read Mark 14 today, you'll recall that it's kind of broken up into two different sections. You've got the pre-Passover events going on, and then you've got the events going on during Passover. Let's take a look at this first chunk right here. What's going on before the Passover? In verse 3, we're told about this really interesting story about this woman who comes to Jesus, and Jesus is like hanging out, chilling with all the fellas, probably playing Xbox, something like that. All of a sudden, she busts in and she breaks a jar of perfume on his feet. And then we're told that that thing is worth like 300 denarii. Now, that doesn't mean all that much to me until we convert it into today's terms, which that would have been about $60,000 to $75,000 that she just poured out on Jesus' feet. Now, if you're anything like me, or anything like the disciples, as you see that, you may say, holy smokes, could we maybe have used that for some better reasons? You know, like maybe take everybody out to lunch, or I don't know, like sponsor like 15 compassion kids, or like feed the poor. I don't know. But Jesus says, no. Don't do that. Don't take this from this woman. She is using this as what she's doing is beautiful. What she's doing is worshipful. What she's doing is she's seeing how valuable I am, and she's trying to express it in her own way. She's trying to match my value with what she has, and she can't do it perfectly, but she's doing it with what she does have. So get off her back. And wherever my gospel is proclaimed, her story will be told based on what she's done. And that's pretty cool. What's so interesting to me about this story is this is not the first time that Jesus commends a woman in the Gospel of Mark for a giving of finances. You'll recall Caleb the other night, he taught us from Mark chapter 12, where a woman comes to the temple and she brings 2 copper coins that are worth like a penny. And she puts them in the coffer, and Jesus says, do you see what she did just now, boys? What she did is she just added more value to the kingdom than those guys over there with their big old bags full of money, because she gave what she had to me. Those guys gave what they had basically to themselves to be able to build themselves up in the eyes of others. Basically, Jesus says what this woman is doing in this story with a lot of money and what this woman in this story is doing with just a little bit of money are exactly the same. It actually has nothing to do with how much they're giving, but rather the heart with which they're giving it. One of the things that Mark wants us to learn from the story is just that. It's not about how much we give, it's about the heart we have as we're giving whatever we have to give. That's encouraging to me because I don't have bags full of money. I don't have like jars of perfume, 1, at all, but 2 just lying around that are worth this much. But I do have 2 copper coins, or I do have skills, talents, whatever that I can give to Jesus. He says it's not about what you have to give, it's about the heart that you have in giving it. Now, this story shifts in Mark 14 to all of a sudden this story about Judas. And here's what I want you to see, is in this first story we just saw, a woman gives up money for Jesus. But in the next story we're about to see with Judas, it's not a woman there, but rather it's Judas himself. And instead of giving money up for Jesus, what do we find? Judas is giving up Jesus for money. What Mark is doing with what he's saying is he's basically saying this: there's 2 types of people out there. Those who give what they have to the glory of God, and those who take from God what they can. The woman gives up her money, she gives up her power, she gives up her resources for Jesus. And Judas is coming and he's giving up Jesus for money, power, and resources. Mark says to you, how about you? What do you give up for the other? Is your world all about getting more of Jesus and giving up anything you can to get that, or is it all about getting everything you can and giving up Jesus to do so? That's the question he wants us to wrestle with. Now, if you're anything like me, when I see this and Judas doing this, I think, holy smokes, most of the time I like to think that I give up my power and my resources for Jesus, but sometimes, honestly, I come to Jesus for money, resources, and power. So how is God going to treat me? What do I need to do in response? Thomas Chalmers has a quote, and he says this: the only way to break the hold of a beautiful object on the soul is to show it an object more beautiful. What is more beautiful than riches and power? I think it's this. It's the fact that even though I was willing to give up Jesus for power and riches, he was willing to give up power and riches for me. So I said, Lord, I want your riches and power, and I took it from him, but he said, you know what? I have riches and power, but I'm giving it up. Why? For you, Dave. And when I see that, I say, holy smokes. If he would do that for me, why would I not want him more than anything else? So if you find yourself wrestling with that just there, I'd encourage you to focus in on this. Even though Jesus had all the riches, all the power, all the fellowship with the Father in heaven, he gave that all up. Why? For you. For me. It's pretty cool. That's the first portion of the story. Let's take a look at the second portion of the story. Now, you might be able to say that this next portion of the story could be broken up into understanding it as God's providence and as God's patience. Now, providence is another word for sovereignty, which is another word for omnipotence, which is another word for all-knowing and all-powerful, put together to basically mean that God is in control of everything. And patience, you already know what that means. Let's take a look at God's providence. Now, how do we see God's providence in this second portion of the story? Well, we first see it in the Passover meal. The disciples come to Jesus, and they're basically like this. Jesus, it's Thanksgiving Day. Technically, it's Passover, but they're like, basically, it's Thanksgiving Day, and we don't have a turkey, and we haven't started the mashed potatoes, and the rolls, we don't even have rolls, and nobody brought a pie. What do you want us to do for Thanksgiving, a.k.a. Passover? Now, Jesus says, guys, don't worry about it. I want you to go in the city. I want you to find a guy carrying water on his shoulder. And I want you to follow him. And wherever he goes, I want you to go up to the master of that house and say, the teacher is ready for his meal. He's going to take you upstairs, and there's going to be a meal prepared for you. Now, if I'm the disciples, I'm thinking, right. So we're going to find a random guy in the city. We're going to follow him, and his master is going to somehow know that we're coming over for dinner that night. He's going to have everything prepped for us, and Jesus is like, exactly. And guess what? The disciples go and do it, and that's exactly what they find. Jesus is showing us, even in just this first little picture right here, that he is in control of everything. He says, it's going to appear random to you that you're going to find this random guy, but it's all a part of my plan. It's going to appear random to you that you go and ask that guy, hey, we're ready, tell that guy we're ready for dinner, but it's all a part of my plan. It's going to appear like the room was just, happenstance set up, but it's all a part of my plan. And Jesus wants us to be thinking this. If the meal is a part of his plan and it's all orchestrated, is not everything else that's about to follow orchestrated? Answer is plot twist. You're not plot twist, but what do you say that? Oh, spoiler alert. Yes, it's all planned. In fact, it's not just the Passover meal that's planned. It's even what Jesus says at the dinner. It's everything that's going to follow. Jesus is saying this is all a part of my plan. At the meal itself, Jesus is going to say, hey, we're about to go through some really cruddy stuff. One of you is going to deny me. My body's going to be broken. I'm going to be killed for you all. And when that happens, I don't want you to think that it's random. And then he's going to come to Peter and he's going to say, hey, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. And when it happens, I don't want you to think that it's random and that I don't know about it and that I don't still love you. And Peter's going to say, no, that's never going to happen. And Jesus is like, yeah, no, buddy, it is going to happen. It's all a part of the plan. Jesus is showing us his providence through this story to get us to understand that God is in control of everything. If I was a disciple who is hanging out with Jesus in the garden, and all of a sudden he gets snatched up, he gets falsely accused, falsely tried, eventually put up on the cross, I'm going to be thinking in my mind, God is not in control of this situation. If God was in control of this situation, he would do something about it. But Jesus wants them to know before it's all going to happen that he's in control of every last detail, including the boy carrying water in the middle of the city that they bump into. It's the start of 1,000 sequences of events that is all a part of God's gracious plan to put Jesus up on a cross that he might die for the world. It's pretty cool. The first thing Mark wants us to see in this passage is God's providence, but that's not all he wants us to see. He also wants us to see God's patience. How so? Jesus says, all right, boys, let's go out to the garden. I'm going to pray, and if you'll please pray for me and pray for you as I'm praying, that would be beautiful. But what does Jesus come back to find? He comes back to find the disciples asleep. Now, I can understand one time them falling asleep, but what does Jesus do? He wakes them up and he says, please pray, please pray. But what happens? He goes off to pray and he comes back and again, they're asleep. Now, if I'm Jesus here in this moment, what am I doing? I'm probably walking out on my disciples. I'm probably saying, boys, I have served you for 3 years, day in and day out. I've given you everything I've got, and I just asked for 1 hour for you to be praying with me. And instead, twice you fall asleep. I'm out of here. But that's not what Jesus does. He's patient with them. Even as 1,000 guards come into the garden to capture Jesus, and the disciples, one of them pulls out a sword and cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. Even then, Jesus is patient in the fact that he doesn't say, you know what? Take this guy. Take this guy instead. I've often thought, Man, if I were Jesus in that moment, I'd say, you know what? After 3 years, these guys don't get it, and he just cuts your ear off with a sword. I tell you what, you can take him. Or you know what, take me and take him with me. But that's not what Jesus does. In fact, in the other Gospels, we find out that Jesus says, you know what, let them go. And that's exactly what they do. The disciples, what do we find them doing? They abandon Jesus. We're told that one of them literally runs away naked. Now that's physical, absolutely, but it's also representative of the shame that the disciples ought to be feeling here and now as their king, as the one they've been following 3 years. Now when the rubber hits the road, when things get tough, what do? They walk out on him. And yet, even though they walk out on Jesus, he still doesn't walk out on them. He goes to the trial where he's falsely accused. The witnesses can't even get their lies straight. Eventually they say, are you the Christ? And Jesus says, I am, which is the truth. The Pharisees had every right to put somebody to death if they equated themselves to be God, if they weren't God, but Jesus was. He's telling the truth, and what happens in result of it? He gets spit on, he gets punched, they put a bag over his head and they strike him, and they say, prophesy, which one of us hit you? Now think about this. This is the God of the universe. In a moment, he could have flexed and destroyed all of them, but he didn't. He's not only in control of everything, he's incredibly patient. Even as we find Peter outside the temple gates denying that he ever knew his best friend Jesus. God doesn't say, you know what, that's it. I'm done with this whole thing. I'm out of here. And the most loving and gracious, kind act in all of human history, he decided to stay, even though everyone had walked out on him. He decided not to respond back and lash out, even though everyone was lashing out against him. This is amazing. In this story, we not only see that God is in control, but we also see that God is gracious. And that is of great comfort to me because I'm just like the disciples. I quite literally fall asleep when I'm not supposed to be falling asleep. I quite literally lash out when I'm not supposed to lash out. I quite literally abandon God and all my beliefs and everything I know about him on a regular basis when times get tough. I'm like, even like the high council in regards to like the fact that I oftentimes accuse God falsely of not being there for me, of not loving me, of all these different things. And so often, either in word, action, or deed, I deny Christ in my heart of hearts, saying, no, I don't really know that guy. Every time I sin, I'm pretty much denying Christ, and yet even in that moment, he still does not deny me. And he came down on the cross and he died for me. And that is, I can't wrap my mind around it. So here's what I know. Tomorrow, this week, this month, this year, you may run into some difficult things. In that season, it's important to remember this. God is in control and God is gracious. If he didn't give up on the disciples here, what makes you think that he's going to give up on you now? That's something to put in our pipes and smoke for a while. Not that you should be smoking unless it's like a metaphorical kind of smoke, but it's something to think upon, stew upon. That's healthier than smoking. Awesome. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed Mark 14. I've had a great time hanging out with you. Hope you have a good night. Get some sleep. Think about this. Think about the Lord. And join Jenna tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. for Mark 15. And then join us Sunday at HSM for the finale, the grand finale of our Mark series. Much love. Shout out. Have a good night.